Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome to Rare Classic Cars. And yes, you're probably asking yourself, you said Rare Classic Cars, what is this doing here? Well, I have to confess, I have a soft spot for these General Motors C&H bodies because, frankly, I grew up on them. These were the cars that I remember from my childhood, and when I was in college, the thing that really started my whole collector car hobby was buying these GM vehicles. I could buy a grandma car with 20,000 miles for $1,500, fix a few minor things, turn around and sell it for close to $3,000. I did that so many times because these cars run bad longer than most cars run, and came to know them really, really well. So I also had, as I would say, one of my early cars, the 1986 Oldsmobile Delta 88 Royale Brougham, which I absolutely loved. The velour, loose cushion seats. And when this 86-98 came up for sale a few years ago in North Carolina when I lived there, I had to buy it. It was, not expensive, and it was just in absolutely mint condition. The undercarriage on this thing is absolutely flawless, and you'll see the underhood area is as well. So let's talk a little bit about these C bodies and also the H bodies and kind of what they meant to General Motors at the time, because this was a revolutionary car. This is General Motors' first full-size, front-wheel drive, transversely mounted engine vehicle. So they obviously had the X cars that came out in the 1980 model year, the Citation, the Phoenix, the Skylark, and the Omega, that started this whole transversely mounted engine. In other words, the engine is mounted sideways here in the engine compartment as opposed to longitudinally, the traditional way. The X cars really started that for GM. Then you had the J and the A cars, the J car being the Cavalier, Forenza, Skyhawk, as well as the J2000 or later Sunbird. And then you had the A cars, the Chevrolet Celebrity, Pontiac 6000, Cutlass Sierra for Olds, and then the Buick Century. So this came later. Those came in the early 80s. This came in 1985, although this vehicle was supposed to be introduced in the 1983 model year, but was delayed for a number of reasons. One, General Motors was just going through a really rough time in the early 80s. And then they had some significant durability issues in the proving ground test, particularly with the front-wheel drive transmission in this vehicle. So that delayed it all the way to the 1985 model year. These cars came out in early 1984. And they weren't wholly finished either, I would say, under hood. So it's interesting, as the years tick by on these cars, the powertrain improvements are pretty myriad. So in 1985, there were 3 engine choices in the Olds and Buick. There was this 3-liter 2-barrel V6, which was abysmal, terrible carburetor, and just a really weak bottom end on that engine. They don't hold up. So tend to stay away from that engine if you see some in the A bodies as well. Then they had the 3.8, which in 1985 was multi-port injected, didn't have crank trigger ignition, still had a distributor. It didn't have sequential port injection, it had multi-port injection. And it made 125 horsepower in 1985. And then for 1 year only in the C bodies, they had the 4.3-liter V6 diesel as an option. So the Olds 98, the Buick Electra, those were the C bodies for Buick and Olds. Cadillac had the Deville, the little front-wheel drive Deville, in which you could get the 4.1-liter V8 or the Oldsmobile V6 diesel again for 1 year. And by the time 1986 rolls around, under hood, that carbureted 3-liter goes away. And the 3.8 gets sequential port fuel injection, gets crank triggered or distributorless ignition, gets more horsepower, either 140 or 150 horsepower, depending upon whether or not you have roller lifters in the engine. This 98 is a 140 horsepower version. And it would steadily climb as the years went by. This is a pre-3800 3.8-liter V6. No balance shaft in here. We call it even firing. So it does have some interesting internals associated with it, namely that the connecting rods are not in the center of the piston. They're off-center, and that's driven by the crankshaft. General Motors was trying to get a smoother engine out of this 90-degree V6 than really was possible without a balance shaft, and they finally caved to having a balance shaft in 1988. So this is a pre-balance shaft 3.8-liter engine, and in general, why do I really like these cars? I said they were revolutionary, and again, it's the first full-size front-wheel drive car for GM that's transversely mounted front-wheel drive. But they're they're very spacious and open and airy. And despite the fact that this car took, the 98 in 1984 was on a 119-inch wheelbase and was 220 plus inches long. This car shaved off 2 feet off of that overall length. The wheelbase went down to a little less than 111 inches as well. And it shed a little over 700 pounds. And yet on the inside, the interior dimensions and the packaging on this vehicle, frankly, are excellent. And I would say world class. Not just for the time, but even for today. If you sit in this car and you compare it to a modern day vehicle, it feels so much more open and airy, in part driven by, you can see the really low belt line, tremendous glass area, thin A-pillars, and there's not that feeling anymore. It also doesn't have the chunky center console in which nowadays they often package a bunch of electronics. Here, that doesn't exist. You just have a front bench, split bench seat, and you have so much room to spread out. So it's amazing that even by today's standards, these cars are quite contemporary. Sure, they don't have airbags and all the safety tech, but it gets really good gas mileage. This car will get 26, 27 freeway. If you have a 3800 engine powered version of these that came out in 1988, you can get over 30 miles per gallon on the freeway with these routinely. It's not like you're having to hypermile to get that. They actually get that very routinely on these vehicles. And they do it in comfort. I will say that from owning one of these, what's superlative on these, even by today's standards? The seat comfort is excellent. The HVAC systems are ridiculously good. This car has probably the coldest air conditioning of any car that I've ever owned. It's so cold that even if I'm driving on an 80-some degree day, the interior temperature will get down to about 50 degrees. And moisture will start forming on the outside of the window glasses, even on a sunny day, because the exterior surface of the glass gets below the dew point temperature. And in some cases, you have to run the windshield wipers because it's not fogging over on the inside. It's actually creating moisture on the outside of the glass because the glass temperature gets so cold when you're running the air conditioning if you run it at full blast. So that doesn't happen anymore. Now I think the engineers are more concerned about the evaporator freezing over under hood, and the outlet temperature isn't as cold as it is on these. They try to have more fan speed to compensate for that. But if you want super cold air blowing in your face, get one of these vehicles. The heat's also excellent. So seat comfort, fuel economy, HVAC systems, trunk space, interior packaging, all that, to be honest, is still world class, even by today's standards. Now, the Oldsmobiles in particular had a pretty mushy suspension. I would say even mushier than the Buicks and the Cadillacs. But you could get an optional FE3 package in these. This car doesn't have it. And now you can certainly change. They have heavy-duty struts and quick struts that you can put on these if you want to firm up the suspension a little bit. But I've left this one as it is at stock. It's a low-mileage car. It's very clean, and I just enjoy driving it. So let's take a little bit more of a walk around this 1986 Olds 98, and I'll talk about some more of the features. All right, so here's a brief walk around, and this car is pretty loaded. This is a 98 Regency, not the Regency Brougham, which was even more up level than this. But when you got the Regency, you got this tufted, loose cushion velour interior here. Regency Brougham had a different cloth pattern I'll put a picture of. Got the nice embroidery on the armrest. And interestingly, you got vinyl outside of the area where you immediately touch it. But you get this feeling of airiness in the cabin, I think in part because this dashboard is pushed so far forward, which is good and bad. It gives you that open air feeling, but the reach envelope for the driver to try to change, in this case the automatic climate control or the radio controls, is pretty long. It's too long, to be honest. But I'm guessing, like I said, they did that to make the car feel open and airy. I do have the seat all the way back, and there's still quite a bit of room in the back seat. Lots of headroom in these, driven by this vertical D-line, which in interviewing the designers who designed this, And stay tuned for that. We actually interviewed on this channel John Manoogian, who was responsible or worked on this design. And he related that that vertical D-line in part came from the success of the original 1976 to 79 Seville, and that vertical backlight that it had. So it was so successful that General Motors copied it and started trickling it down to some of the lesser known models. I think it's actually quite handsome here. Notice the 98 also picks up on some of the Cadillac cues. Olds did this for years, back to the, I would say, early 60s, having these vertical taillights on the 98 to pick up the Cadillac cue. It's kind of an interesting choice because it is such a Cadillac signature, and here it is on an Olds. The 88 had much blockier taillights, including the amber turn signals on some years. This car does have the cornering lights up front, and it does still have the sealed beam headlights, which would go away in 1987. So this was the last year for the sealed beams, and I know a lot of people prefer the smoother look of the glass front end. I actually like the sealed beam look better, which was why I bought this car, because it was an 86. And if you want to buy one of these, I would advise you try to stay away from the 85. The 85 still had some teething issues. They still even had that in 86. If you want the best years for reliability of these boxier C&H body cars, get one from 1988 on. Stay away from the 85 and 6. By 87, they're pretty good, but by 88, you get the 3800 with the balance shaft under hood, and it's just a better car. But I like the way that this looked, and as I mentioned, I had an 86 Olds 88. So I wanted, when I saw this, even though it was a 98, I thought that I should pick it up. I do love Oldsmobile had a unique chime on these when you open the door, which the other divisions didn't have. Cadillac had a real bell that would ding, and Buick just had a different sound to it. But it's kind of a gentle, more gentle chime. This car has idiot lights, no gauges. You could get an optional gauge package. As I mentioned, it does have the automatic climate control, which is not fully automatic. You have to control the fan speed and the air outlet. It only automatically controls the temperature outlet, kind of like the Tempmatic system as opposed to Comfortron. This does have the cassette tape player option as well, including the power antenna, which amazingly still works. You can see it here. I'll turn the key on. There it goes. You know the car is well taken care of if the power antenna still works. And in these cars, the radio is actually quite good. I mean, it really sounds good, particularly for the era. Look at the rich door panels as well on these. Fully, full cloth upper, all soft touch, carpeted lower, very expensive door panel in spite of the fake wood. The 98s had the fake wood, the 88s had like a faux aluminum brushed metal look. That is the air compressor for the low leveling rear in the back going on. This car also has Twilight Sentinel, which turns your lights on automatically. It does have cruise control and delay wipers on this single multi-function stock, with some people hate. I actually don't mind this. I don't know why people griped about it. It works just fine for me. I actually prefer it because you just look in one spot for everything. Tilt wheel, which was optional, power seats both sides. Just a very rich interior, even padded A-pillars here that you can see. And the seat comfort is great. I've owned so many of these cars and I love them because you can take road trips in these. They get great mileage. There's tons of room, great trunk space. I mean, there's really not much to complain about. Let's pop the trunk and then we'll pop the hood as well. This has the automatic trunk release. Let's take a look back there. We'll also pop the hood. So really big trunk in these, especially for the size of the car. And I think some of that's facilitated by the vertical taillight theme here. The Cadillacs also have a big trunk. You'll see when we interviewed John, he talks about how on those cars, GM had this interesting design theme where the belt line was lower than either the front or the rear fender. So take a look at the car and you'll see the belt line here at the bottom of the window glass is beneath where the trunk line is and beneath where the front fender line is. So it gives you a bigger trunk. It also shrinks this backlight down, and the Cadillac is even more extreme. This delta here between, or the difference between where the belt line is and where the trunk starts. So it gives you a smaller backlight, more private, more intimate, makes the trunk bigger with more vertical distance as well. And I even have some of the original Oldsmobile cassette tape for it, the original owner's manual, the door edge guards, which I take off of all my vehicles because I think that makes them look better. It's a service part sticker that GM started putting on these vehicles if you want to ever decode them. But lots of space, nicely carpeted. Spare tire is beneath the mat here, under that. Let's take a look under hood. So this car has the 3.8 liter sequential port fuel injected V6, which has the crank trigger distributorless ignition up there. It's a non-3800, as I mentioned, no balance shaft. So it's funny, when I bought this car, the previous owner said, well, you know, the car seems to run okay, but it shakes a little bit sometimes. And I chuckled and I thought to myself, well, that's normal for these. And actually this car runs, I would say, smooth for the era and for what it is. This one's probably the smoothest operating one that I've ever driven. They have a bit of a shake, particularly at fast idle, but at idle speed and at cruising speed, they're very smooth, unless they're out of tune. This is the infamous 440 T4 front transaxle here that had so many drivability and durability issues, and they're notoriously clunky in terms of the shift quality. This one, I don't know if it's ever been rebuilt. I don't see a Hydromatic sticker saying that it's a replacement unit, but somehow this one shifts relatively smoothly. Again, the smoothest shifting that I've ever seen or driven. If you come to a stop after driving on the freeway and your car stalls out, chances are it's a torque converter lockup solenoid, particularly on any of these 80s or early 90s era GM cars. You can just unplug this connector and that will no longer happen. You're going to lose about 5% mileage on the freeway, but if you can't afford to get it fixed and you need to fix it, just unplug that and you're going to be just fine. This is the mass airflow sensor I was talking about that gave GM so many troubles. And this was the first application where General Motors used this. You can see the airflow comes in here. There is a hot film that the air passes over, and this reads basically the amount of air and the density of it to help the computer determine how much fuel to inject. Well, on the early years, you'll notice that the cross-sectional area of these mass airflow sensors is the same. In 1987, this was redesigned, and there's a Venturi section here. And they also have, if I were to take this out, this would just be open to the air cleaner element on this side. In 1987, there's a little honeycomb flow straightener to get straighter airflow, the Venturi to get faster airflow over that sensor. The reason I know that is because I went to school at University of Michigan, and one of my professors, I was an engineering student, had one of these on his shelf, and he helped General Motors redesign it for 1987. So, interesting tidbit of information. But you can see super clean engine bay. There's not even any road grime or debris down here. I don't know how the owner did that, but she kept it very, very clean. So let's start it up and you can hear it and you can see, if I put the camera here, you'll see the engine rock a little bit as it's idling. That's just the way these are. That's perfectly normal, nothing to worry about. By 1988 with the 3800, that goes away. Tough to pick up, but you can kind of see a little bit of rocking there, I think. You can see the air cleaner housing is jiggling a little bit. Even the hood is jiggling a little bit. That's just how they run. And again, they smooth out when you're driving them. You don't feel that harshness at idle. You do feel it at fast idle, but that's really about the only time. The Cadillacs did have 2 fans. The Olds and Buicks just had 1. And the Cadillac has a more complex fan speed controller as well. Again, these are the cars I grew up on fixing. Owned so many of these. Often, issues with this cause drivability issues, or the EGR valve is stuck and hung open. Really outside of that, there aren't too many issues with these. The water pumps usually last pretty long. They do have the plastic timing chain gears that tend to shred a tooth. Around 120, 130,000 miles, somewhere in that zip code. The other issue that these tend to have in the early years is the power steering racks go bad. You'll notice that they have what's called morning sickness. It'll be hard to turn the wheel. Very typical on any front-wheel drive General Motors car from the early 80s until the late 80s, unfortunately. But that's it for under hood. Overall, just a handsome car, and I would say relatively modern, especially if you were to take these moldings off and the little detailing, like where it says Regency, and you put aluminum wheels on it, kind of like what they did for the later touring sedan. It's a pretty modern profile. And as we talked to John Manoogian, who was one of the designers on this program, you'll hear a little bit, we talk about how modern cars almost have these origami, or he calls it complex, or complexity on the body sides. This car is the antithesis of that. Super clean, straight, no fuss. I think consequently it looks so modern because nobody does that now. And to be honest, it looks better to my eye. Maybe that's why I have one. There were a number of wheel covers for this car. This obviously has the wire wheel covers. They had a really handsome aluminum wheel as well. So we'll take it for a brief drive and you can experience the 98 for yourself. All right, so here we are in the Olds. First impression driving down the road is this is quite a quiet cabin, especially by the standards of the day. Driving here on the asphalt pavement, there's really not much in the way of engine or road noise. And the ride is pretty comfortable. This car did have 4-wheel independent suspension, which for the time, and particularly for GM, was very advanced. The engine's also very smooth, as I said, outside of the fast idle range. So sitting here at the stoplight, the idle speed comes down, and it's pretty smooth. Is it velvety? No. Nobody's going to mistake it for a Lexus V6. But the engine has lots of torque. The other impression here as you sit in it is that the throttle response is ridiculously good, particularly at just stepping off from idle. In later years, when the 3800 came out, GM would actually retard the timing in first gear because some people thought this pedal was too sensitive. And it really is sensitive. You barely touch the pedal and you start moving. Great torque. If you floor the car, it's not overly fast. There's not a huge amount of horsepower here, but it drives like a much more powerful car than it actually is. No issues keeping up with traffic at all. It isn't overly hot right now, so I just have the vent on, the coldest setting. But like I said, the air conditioner in this car is ridiculously cold. Good heat as well. And an amazingly uncluttered view out the front and the sides with relatively thin A-pillars. Big door glass here. You almost feel so exposed in this car because it sits low to the ground compared to the SUVs of today, and you have so much glass area. But it's very pleasant. There's no blind spots really in this car at all. The transmission is, in this one, the best that I've driven in these vehicles. They do lock up in third gear. So once you're going about 35 miles an hour in third gear, they'll lock up once warm. And that caused, some challenges for some people. It is a 4-speed automatic. GM's first front-wheel drive, transverse mounted, 4-speed transaxle that had so many teething problems with it. By the time 1988 rolled around, though, and this transmission started getting some electronic controls, it was much, much more reliable. So if you have one of these 85 or 6 models, the transmission will last, but I just recommend don't push it, and you should be fine. Change the fluid every 30-ish thousand miles, something in that zip code. But it's got some scoot to it too. Not overly fast. I always make sure I let off most of the way before it upshifts, just for the reasons I described.
So quite a pleasant vehicle and with good gas mileage too. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching this video on the 1986 Oldsmobile 98. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, as that helps the YouTube algorithm serve this up to more viewers like you. Until next time, check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you, and stay tuned for an interview with John Manoogian, who is one of the designers of this Oldsmobile 98 and also worked on the 1985 Cadillac Deville program. John will share some of his original sketch work and talk about the design themes of the vehicle, coming soon. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.